Again, and I'm Falami DeVoe, as you have heard and seen the emails from me, welcoming you to this virtual colloquium. And I'd like to first thank Provost Terry Ratliff for your support during this time and getting the message out. That is much appreciated. And you all would not be here today in this Zoom session if it were not for Ken Pienkos. I was trying to pronounce his name correctly. And he set all of this up, and I am just so grateful for him being able to navigate this Zoom world and get everyone set up here today. And then most definitely, I want to thank Joe in trusting me and just having a wonderful working relationship as we organize this today. And I'd like to also thank the wonderful faculty that we have now. As I looked at the registration last night, I saw just a couple of names that I recognize, so please forgive me if I do not call your name, but I did see Paul Lucas and Nathan Woods and Ian Eggleston. And if there are others that I did not call, please, Joseph Kinzer, please let me know, and I most definitely will recognize you, because I do thank you and we thank you for your commitment to our students. And then most definitely our wonderful presenters. We have Dr. Wendy Peters, we have Rashad Nelms all the way from Rome, Italy, and Dr. Ateem George, Dr. Angel Martinez, and Dr. Laurel Tien. And so thank you. So before we begin, I do want to take a brief moment in silence, just to send light and love to those who have suffered loss and grief during this time. Thank you. We have experienced a flood of virtual learning opportunities during the last 8 weeks, from free virtual museum tours to online concerts, DJ sets by your favorite artist, and the list goes on and on. Our calendars have been full. Finding ways to not only tune into our need for connection outside the walls of our home. So I wanted just to thank you, and again, thank you and appreciate you for choosing to spend this afternoon with us. So for the next few minutes, I just want us to land in this particular community space, because this is a virtual community space. And I just want you to plant your feet on the ground and just to focus on whatever that is that creates stillness in this moment. And I want you just to take some deep breaths, because many of us might not, including myself, no, I did breathe a little bit this morning when I did yoga, might not have breathed a lot as we were getting ready, hurriedly trying to find the email to hit the Zoom link so that we can be here on time. So I'd like for you just to plant your feet on the ground, connect to the earth. And I'd like for you, and as you can see, I have my peaceful background here. I'd like for you just to take some deep breaths, just in this moment, and just to land here in this virtual community space where we're going to learn how to lead, live, and learn during this time. Let's just take one more. Thank you. So our attention for today is to give space and voice to how we can lead, live, and learn. This has been a very difficult time for all of us across the world. And so we encourage you to chat, to tweet, and to reflect. You may chat in the chat box, tweet using the hashtags COVID-19, Antioch University, and hashtag lead, live, and learn. And I'll put this in the chat box periodically. So chat about whatever it is that speaks to you. Tweet about whatever it arises for you. Gives you the warm fuzzies or something that you really want other people to know that our presenters are saying. And then reflect on what you can do with this information once you leave here today. So let us begin with our first presenter, Dr. Wendy Peters. Dr. Peters is an affiliate faculty with Antioch University and a health and community psychologist who lives in the Dayton, Ohio area. Wendy, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Falami. I have a PowerPoint to go along with my talk, but I'm not sure how it's going to view over the screen share. So it may not be what you traditionally see when you see a PowerPoint presentation, but you'll be able to see something. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. When I try to move it over to presenter mode, I can't, it doesn't go right. So we're just going to look at it from the viewer mode here. So the name of my talk today is Intergenerational Survivance, Perspectives from Indigenous Wisdom. And what does that mean? Well, first of all, let me start by introducing myself a little bit more. I am Native Hawaiian, hold on, and I am, I'm originally from Hawaii. My family's all still there. I was raised in a very traditional manner, and I left Hawaii many years ago, and I've been living in the States ever since. But again, I get home every so often, and culturally, ethnically, I identify as Native Hawaiian. And from my cultural worldview, I set off on a journey of scholarship and education, primarily because growing up around me, I saw a lot of strife, a lot of poverty, a lot of undereducation, a lot of oppression, marginalization where Hawaiian people are concerned. And my educational and scholarship trajectory set out to find out why was that, because I didn't see these people in the same way. When one of my children was 12 years old, he went to Hawaii to spend the summer at grandma's house. And he called after a couple weeks. This is a 12-year-old, and he said, I want to come home. He goes, because, people treat the Hawaiians badly and they're all poor, and I just want to come home to my own house and not be treated this way. All the Hawaiians, they live in the ghettos, and it's only white people and Asian people who have nice homes and nice cars. Now, mind you, we're a very middle-class family. We are not affluent or wealthy by a long shot, but in comparison to how Native Hawaiians lived, even witnessed by a 12-year-old, the difference, the disparity was readily apparent. So what does that have to do with what I'm talking about here? Well, I went on a long journey of scholarship, and I found out, I learned many things. And the first thing that I learned about, well, let me back up a second. Let me talk about my title, Intergenerational Survivance. So intergenerational is pretty self-explanatory. We're talking about multiple generations, but the word survivance, I do not believe you will find in most dictionaries. It's because it was coined, a term coined by a researcher, a Native researcher, and he intended it to connotate a strengths-based perspective of survival across generations. So that's where my higher educational trajectory began. It was my doctoral dissertation research on intergenerational trauma that led me to what I'm going to talk about today. But before I can talk about today, I have to talk about yesterday, not literally, obviously. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history and background about intergenerational trauma, or some call it historical trauma, if you're not already familiar. Now, while Native peoples in the US are not the only Native indigenous people to have experienced this. In fact, intergenerational trauma was discovered by researchers who were working with Jewish Holocaust survivors. And they found out that people in contemporary generations, even adoptees, people who had no knowledge of their ancestry, of their lineage, of the past history of the Holocaust that occurred during World War II, were having these traumatic episodes related to things that occurred during the Holocaust. And researchers put this string of symptoms and phenomena and occurrences together, and they came up with something called intergenerational trauma, which is the transmission of the symptoms and experience of trauma over multiple generations. And so, where Native people are concerned, that happened during the periods of colonization, when European settlers first came to the Americas. And in Hawaii, it was not just American settlers, but there were many intrepid explorers and travelers who set out into the Pacific and came to Hawaii. But suffice it to say, in Hawaii, where there were about 500,000 Hawaiians upon first outside contact, within the space of 50 years, over 90% of Hawaiians died off due to disease and other things. And so when you have this type of a massive traumatic experience, it not only leaves an impact with the individual, but it leaves an impact with an entire society. And so Hawaiians have their version of intergenerational trauma. Native Americans have theirs. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit more about the history. Then I'm going to go into how it's transmitted, what is transmitted, and then we're going to talk about what we can do. So let's talk about first the history a little bit, the evidence and the science. So the Australian Human Rights Commission has this definition of intergenerational trauma. Basically, they reference genocide, the loss of culture, and the forcible removal of family and communities, from family and communities. And then left unresolved, it stays with the individual, but it also stays with the culture, it stays with the society, and it's passed on through generations. So for the Native Americans, many Native Americans prefer to call it historical trauma. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart was the cardinal researcher for Native Americans who brought it to the forefront of Native American communities and culture, and she called it a cumulative, emotional, psychological, social, and spiritual wounding over the lifespan and across generations resulting from this massive group trauma. So just a few examples, I'm talking about things like residential boarding schools where children were literally hogtied and dragged from their homes. There are a couple of generations of Native Americans that called the relocation generations. They were adopted out into foster care to get them away from their families and their parents And back in the days of the Carlisle School, which is one of the most notable residential boarding schools for Native Americans, their slogan was "Kill the Indian and save the man." I think many of you may have heard that. If you haven't, you're welcome to back channel me, because there's a lot of very unsettling history that happened over the period of colonization for Native Americans all across this country. Suffice it to say that I'm starting my talk because we're talking about COVID. This COVID too has ended up being a massive group trauma. It has not only impacted people in this country, it has impacted people all over the world, and not just in getting sick. It has killed a lot of people. It has maimed a lot of people, because even those who have recovered will have lifelong, lasting effects from the impact of COVID-19. And so I think we could certainly classify COVID-19 as a potential intergenerational trauma or historical trauma, but we won't know yet until future generations. But it is that big. So I want to share with you the experience of Native peoples and their cultures, because they have been victims of attempted genocide, of colonization, of marginalization, of all of these things that have created this wounding and this societal scourge, if you will, in much the same way that COVID-19 has impacted us here in contemporary society. Yet there are many Native people who are still here, who have survived all of these historical episodes of trauma and scourge and pestilence, if you will, and we're still productive and continuing. And that's what Survivance is all about. So I want to explain to you a little bit about the science behind epigenetics. And for those who may not already be familiar, epigenetics is what we call the way that these traumatic experiences are passed on. Now, it's not literally through the genes or the DNA, but it is in the way that the DNA is expressed. So let me give you an example that most people will be able to relate to. I'm sure all of you have been to the doctor and have been told you may have tendency for this or tendency for that because of the hereditary things that travel in your family, like diabetes or cancer or so forth. So let's take diabetes. Male children are at higher risk for diabetes than female children, but nonetheless, all children of a diabetic have that risk factor for diabetics because it's carried in the gene. But whether or not the gene expresses that diabetes has to do with nurture, so the diabetes is the nature component of the gene, and the expression is the nurture component. So the diabetes may or may not ever express itself in that individual despite their risk factor, unless their environment potentially provokes that. So say overeating to the point of obesity, which triggers the diabetes or something, whereas a sibling, even a twin, even an identical twin sibling, may not have that occurrence. That's what it means by gene expression. It is in the gene, but it may not necessarily come up. So the intergenerational trauma and historical trauma are in the genes of those who have experienced it, but it may or may not express in future generations depending on the environment in which the person exists. Memetics comes from social sciences, and memetics is a similar thing to epigenetics. It's a cultural item that's transmitted in a manner similar to hereditary, and it is propagated and transmitted in memories, I suppose, okay, in memories. Now, many of you have heard of a meme. Memetics is the study of memes, or I wouldn't call it a science, but it's those cultural items that we learn, that we know, that we experience, that are passed down from one generation to the next. And for Native peoples, we know that those memories are still within us. Now, here's the thing. When I began as a researcher, I saw all these negative things in Native people, in Native societies and communities. And I thought that just can't be so. I was born and raised within these groups of people, within these communities, and that's not all I saw. But that's all that researchers ever looked for whatever reason. They always wanted to see what was wrong with us, what was wrong with us. So, you know, about 10 or 15 years ago, Native scholars started to turn the tables, and they started to look for things that were strengths-based. So here I have a description of the theoretical model, if you will, that I used when I began my research, because it held true then and it holds true now. It's quite a mouthful of jargon, but basically, to put it simply, we are always learning, growing, changing, and yet, and that's the nature part, right? We're learning, growing, changing. But the nurture part, the environmental conditions under which we live, tend to prompt issues and problems for us to consider and to address. Once we address those problems and we reach a state of equilibrium, nature is then balanced. Well, then nurture steps in yet again. And it messes things up for us to invoke our emergence into new states of being, new ways of thinking, and that again spurs growth. So it's a cycle, and it goes beyond Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because I like to think we never stop growing. We never reach the pinnacle of development. We are continually evolving, growing, and learning. So I took this theory and I applied it to Native people in my research, and I saw their strengths. I sought out their strengths, and I want to say that what I learned was that they are some of the wisest people. And how do I know that? Because we're still here. We have been here, and we have predated most Western civilizations on this planet. We have been able to sustain ourselves through millennia because of the way we think and we do things, because of what is in our genes and what we know. Now, I'm not limiting this gift of ancestry, if you will, to just myself because of my Native ancestry. This gift belongs to every one of us. We're all descended from someone and something who was here way back when. Nobody just appeared in the last generation. We are all descendants of something. So we all have a different set of ancestry, and we can use that to know what's in our genes and what is the potential for expression, not just in the bad stuff like the chronic diseases, or the tendency to be schizophrenic or something like that, but also in the good stuff. in the stuff that causes us to be resilient, that causes us to have ingenuity and to emerge into new ways of thinking. So John Trudell, one of my favorite Native thinkers, said that we participate in this reality from the consciousness of different labels and victimizations. That is very much what I've seen here with the COVID-19 phenomenon. And I say that not as a way of being condescending to people who have had traumatic experience with COVID, but I say that as a suggestion to perhaps shift our perspective to the way that we see things happening. Yes, sickness and loss is not easy, but if we perceive ourselves as victims, we will always be subjugated to that perception. Western education methods also tend to teach and program people what they should believe, not necessarily how to think, especially when you look at the media. The media is always telling us what we should be thinking, and it's wrought with judgment of this person and that person and what they're doing. But yet we very seldom come into a forum where we're taught how to think, how to really be critical of things, and how to weigh pros and cons for ourselves. We're just bombarded with media and airwaves, and they're just constantly telling us what to believe. Belief limits thinking. How does it do that? Because it gives us a notion, it preconceives something, or it conceives something, and it puts boundaries on it. So if we can, let go of the things that we believe and be open to any possibility, then we are open ourselves to truly being able to know how to think. So how do we do this? Well, for Native people, we believe that nature was our greatest teacher, and we were able to learn from observing the patterns and cycles in nature. We also went to great lengths to be part of our environment, not necessarily the master of it. We didn't just do because we could. So for example, the buffalo. Native people took only as much buffalo as they needed to survive, and they revered the buffalo as a sacred animal because it did help to sustain them. When European settlers came to this country, they went from one end of it to another, and they literally slaughtered all the buffalo till they were almost extinct. It was this kind of a mindset that being the master of and having dominion over all, that is what almost caused the extinction of the buffalo. And it had very far-reaching and devastating impact. That was by no means living in harmony with their surroundings. So Native people never lived like that. One of the notions or the myths that were perceived by foreigners when they came to this country was, they thought that Native people were nomadic, or just, they had these small encampments, and they didn't hoard abundance. They didn't have food stores and things like that. And, they just lived very simply with what they had. And they judged them as not being all that bright. And of course, they came over and they did their agriculture and their farming and cultivation. And they said, see, this is how it's done. The reality is, what they saw, I don't know why I'm getting all this feedback all of a sudden. Oh, there, thank you. The reality is that Native people only took what they needed, and they had these small groups of encampments because they moved with the seasons, and they followed where their food grew and flourished, and whether this was four-legged food or food that grew in the ground. So instead of cultivating these large farm areas, they went where blueberries were in season and where grains were in season, and they followed this. Because why? Because the grains would thrive in certain areas, and the berries would thrive in certain areas. So they didn't bring the farm to them. They went to the farm, and they had many places of actual cultivation and food stores, if you will. But they just didn't look like what the European settlers expected, so they judged them incompetent and incapable. And yet they had been here thriving for thousands of years in living in that sustainable way, which was in harmony with the environment. So I have a few more things to say, and that is, we can help change the outcome of what is happening with COVID-19 in much the same way that Native people have been able to survive and sustain themselves over the millennia. And that is to realize that our history is embodied within us, and that our evolution has instilled within our genetics the potential and the ability to survive and be resilient and to prevail. And Franklin Roosevelt said that we cannot always build our future for our youth, but we can build our youth for the future. And I think, you know, that's the better proposition. We can't guarantee what's going to happen. We don't know if there's going to be another relapse of COVID. But instead of pushing back with our political activism and messages, maybe we need to look to our children and make sure that they are prepared for what they may encounter, because I think that is far more important. I mean, it's not that politics isn't important, but it is important that we prepare ourselves first, you know, before we go out into the world and try and change things and perhaps endanger ourselves. So to wrap this all up, you know, I hope that I have shared a little bit with you about how Native cultures have sustained themselves over the generations, over the millennia, despite the worst of circumstances. I also want to say that part of this colloquia is to inform our students of the potential of what is available to them. One of the things that I happen to teach is systems thinking, and this is a description of systems, how to conceptualize systems that I pass on to my students. If you skip to the very bottom, it was something that Martin Luther King said, a very, very wise man. But if you read it, you know, I think it encapsulates very well what we're all going through, but from a strengths-based perspective. So I'll just read it out loud for those who may not be able to see. It really boils down to this: all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And we are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality. This is not a binary world. It's not about us and them. It's about all of us together, because we are all connected, we are all interrelated, and that is one of the most fundamental beliefs in Native wisdom, is we are all related and we are all connected. And we come from that perspective. And I think so often the modern world tends to forget that. So I'm looking forward to speaking with some of you in the breakout room. This is my contact information if any of you have further questions or would like to, discuss anything with me. And I have references for my talk, and I can send them to you if you need them, but I'll just, I'll leave it and wrap it up here and go back to Falami.
Thank you so much, Wendy. So insightful. Just so much information that we can pull from for today. During this pandemic. And just to let you know that we will send out all the PowerPoint presentations to participants, to registered participants. So no worries, you will get this amazing PowerPoint with references. And I love all of the chatting that we're doing here. This is community. So continue to chat, continue to tweet, continue to reflect. So what we're going to do, Wendy, I know you had some questions. We're going to take some, we're running great on time. And so what I'd like for us to do is to go into our breakout session right now, and then we'll come back. I believe you might have had some questions that you wanted to pose to everyone that they can talk about in their breakout sessions. And then when we come back from the breakout session, we'll take some Q&A and to hear what you said in your groups. How does that sound, Wendy?
Sorry, you had to mute. That
Yes.
sounds just fine. Thank you.
All right, so what are those questions that you have? And just to let you know, and thank you, Laurel, we have put a document, a Google Doc in the chat there. We'd like for you to connect to that Google Doc where you will start to collect your thoughts regarding what was said, and then you can share that when you're into your groups. So Wendy, I'm going to let you take the floor for a minute if there's some specific questions that you wanted to have everyone talk about in the breakout session, and then we'll have Joe to put us in our breakout rooms.
Oh, you know what? Maybe I'll also go ahead and type them in the chat so everyone has them. But I guess the first question would be, why is survivance significant as opposed to just surviving? And the second would be, what can you take from native wisdoms, indigenous wisdoms that you think can help you? I have lots of resources that I can also refer to people. I think they are going to follow up with additional resources after the end of the colloquium, so I can include those in that. But those were my questions. I'm going to go ahead and type them on the chat bar.
But type them for you. I've typed them there for you. So
right.
the first question is actually, we have this wonderful editing tool, so decided to edit it for me. So it should say, why is survivance significant as opposed to surviving? They changed it to survivable. So Joe, if you would go ahead and put us in our breakout rooms, and we'll come back and have our Q&A and have some conversation.
Okay. We're going to be in 5 different rooms for 15 minutes, okay? And then you'll have a 30-second reminder when the room is going to close, okay?
All righty, thank you.
I'm going to Okay, well, I guess we're going to have bigger rooms than I thought, but so I'm going to just, I think we can unmute in these rooms and just let it fly and just share what anybody wants to share. And again, these are going to be slightly bigger than I thought, but anybody, there were several questions about the nature of survivance and healing and how we can benefit from indigenous wisdoms. And anyway, I don't want to say any more than that. I'll just let you all say what you want to say. I can call on people too, but let's see. What are you thinking, Angel?
Oh, I gotta say, what a marvelous presentation. First of all, my congratulations to Wendy for putting this together. I think she definitely deserves a round of applause. I know a lot of people are on mute, but I'll still say, got applause for her no matter what. That's right, yeah. One thing I was really struck, I love when new words are created all the time. So I really appreciate this notion of survivance. I think that's great for our vocabulary. I mean, that sense that there's something just beyond the surviving. I mean, we are surviving. I mean, sometimes I greet people who say, they ask me, how you doing? I said, I'm surviving. But what is that act itself? See, there's the thing we do, perhaps in the moment, and then we have that collection of things that occur together, and that survives. And I'm really glad she brought the point of a historical trauma, because these are things that we feel beyond generations. So everything that Wendy said was just right on point. This was just really magnificent. I think and a lot of indigenous and diasporic populations face this. I mean, people that migrate to the United States, like Puerto Ricans and Cubans, for example, the last 200 years, can talk about this. So this is actually a very global phenomenon. I'm glad Wendy framed it globally. I think that really helps us get our conversation started.
What do you think, Bettina?
I was really impressed about the presentation too, and I love the word survivance. It's been new to me. I'm pretty familiar with the word of intergenerational trauma and all those things, but survivance is really significant. I think what it means to me is that we need to look beyond just me surviving or just a certain group surviving. It's really bringing together the history of, I guess, of all nations, and it's so important to bring in the history of First Nations and to look, what does it mean to survive as a world and not just certain groups or, especially privileged groups. So it's been a great discussion, and I'm looking forward to share about the second question. So, but I'll do that later.
Let's see. Let's go to Becca. Are you there? You're on mute, but Becca, you want to share something? How about Melissa? Any impressions? Any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I really love this presentation, and this idea of survivance is something I think I've understood, but without the word for it. And it seems really important to people who can get through a really difficult experience as a culture, as an individual, you come out of it a little bit tougher than you went into it. And that kind of toughness can be a closing down, or it can be like an opening, depending on how you look at it. And so I think survivance kind of denotes this idea that it's a strength that then can bring you into the future and bring you more growth, and this perspective that it's not instantly a closing down and a toughening. It's kind of like this different kind of an opening and a strengthening. So I really appreciate this new word in my vocabulary. And it's very different than surviving, but it also kind of sounds a little more like thriving. And that's probably what I would have used before. So yeah, thank you.
Alexandra, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I was really drawn by the idea that the need for this new term, and how it can also be used interchangeably, but there's a nuance there to suggest a difference, you know, so it's much greater than surviving. And the whole cultural aspect, you know, how it's interconnected. So, you know, it just brings lots of different questions to mind, that it's cross-cultural, intergenerational. So yeah, I mean, it's just, it kind of opens the door for additional conversation about the concept of surviving as an individual and also as a community and as groups. So thank you, Wendy. I really enjoyed your presentation.
I don't know if it's Tanis or you had some interesting comments. I'm curious perspectives from Ecuador.
Thank you, Joe. My name is Tanis. I am originally from Keene, New Hampshire, and I've lived in Ecuador over 25 years, and that's kind of my connection to finding out what's going on at Antioch. Thank you for today. For me, Wendy, I love the way that you kind of took me from this, oh dear, here we are going to talk about, you know, genetics historically again, and people are going to, you know, deal with, I'm this way because I am bringing it historically from my genetics to turning it into the interconnectedness and the consciousness conversation. I wasn't expecting that in the end of your talk, and I love the transition that you brought me through and the preparation for what we have ahead that you prepared me for. I appreciated that a lot. I thought you did a great job with that. And from Ecuador, I was amazed how many similarities there are with the Hawaiian Native experience. And I'm sure this happens around the world, as many people are saying. And there is that difference in that I'm not personally part of that community, but I've been living as a guide, a Montessori guide of many students in that community and people in that community for many years. So I'm not necessarily a first person authority on the subject, but to have watched my children grow in a culture and deal with being US Ecuadorian citizens in a community of students. We have a very multicultural community. Our school is over 40% special needs. And in addition to that, it is also multicultural in socioeconomical realities. To have come from that privileged Keene, New Hampshire background and to have my children as Ecuadorians deal with that has been really interesting. So I've had experiences with shamans down here. I've had experiences with alternative medicine that, you know, my parents in Keene, New Hampshire kind of think I'm crazy. But as you talk about that interconnectedness and the connection with nature, systems, education, systems learning, not sure the exact term, but I hear you and appreciate your introduction to that. And what we can get from nature, I've had over 25 years of experience, in my opinion, learning much more from Ecuador in that sense, and that there's this appreciation of what the plants can give us. There's this appreciation of what the herbs can give us, that, you know, they might be going to doctors, but at the same time, my mother-in-law is giving me 6 different herbal medicines and teas to help me get through what we deal with. So I probably talked about a lot of general subjects there and didn't get very specific about anything, but I just want you to know all that kind of stuff is moving, and I think that's what these webinars are about. So thank you.
Thank you, Tanis. How about Jack? You've always got interesting perspectives on things. You must have one on this.
Aloha, Wendy, and mahalo for the kakua. The word that jumped off the page to me is how to prevail. And actually, the reason I resonate with that is a very close friend of mine who was passing on from cancer after 9 years of survivance, told me in her parting words, "Do not call yourself a survivor, you have prevailed." So when I hear the story about how the Native people coexisted with the land and with nature in harmony, it resonates with me in the middle of COVID, because I have, as you know, I live by the ocean, and I have observed a lot of crazy making dysfunction that alarms me, that people are feeling like they're out of touch with nature because they're in a mode of fear. So how do we take fear and transmute it to what Wendy spoke about as the Native American people? The strength is their wisdom. So that's my focus with this pandemic, is how do I learn from it and reconfigure the way I love and appreciate nature and let it continue to teach me.
That's nice. Joe, can I interject here? Since we are having this group conversation, still feel free to add your individual thoughts in the Google link where we're collecting our generative wisdom here for this afternoon. So please make sure that you make your comments there if we don't get a chance to hear from you as we're talking. And we still have another 5 or 10 minutes left before we take a break. So feel free to share. I'm loving, again, the chat that we're doing there. And welcome to all of the new folks that have joined us this afternoon.
I think there's several who may want to speak. So please do right now. If you have something, say it.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah.
Wendy, aloha. I'm transitioning to that second question about Native or Indigenous wisdom. I've had the good fortune of visiting Hawaii twice in my life. And my view when I left the island was, I love aloha, the aloha spirit. That should be our value, and that should be our #1 export to the world, is that aloha spirit. When I was living and working on the US-Mexico border, I took a class in Huna, the ancient Native Hawaiian, I would say, esoteric tradition. And one of the things that I learned from the Huna practice, and there are some things that I've incorporated into my practice, is the power of vision and the power of vision to initiate change. And the one thing I would say is I remember being told to hold a picture in your mind and then say, take it from black and white to color in your mind. And that is change. You've created change. That's a very simple example, but I think a very powerful one. So just to say that I have learned much from Hawaiian wisdom traditions, and I so welcome everything that you shared today. I can't wait to wade into your references and to start reading. Mahalo.
Others, anyone else have something to share? I know you do. I can call on you.
Yes, Dr. Khan, I got a question.
Yes.
That is nagging in my mind. Dr. Wendy, you are very, very detailed talk because she's a psychologist and she has a background too. Of how trauma comes about and how, but there is a fundamental difference. You see, when the British came to Hawaii, it was like a man-made trauma. And the covert, I mean, a lot of us think, and it might be true or not, it's a natural thing, but it's something that came out of somewhere. So you see, the tactics to deal with may be the same. You go out in nature, or you avoid dirt and dust, and then you escape from the colonial troops. But the thing is that the psychological impact should be different. This is something that came from the nature, I mean, whatever you call it. And that is something that was man-made. So survivor's technique will be the same. You go out, you escape, you evade, and you survive. But the feeling of it and then carrying on it through a generation is different. You see, one you think as an injustice, as ruthlessness, and this you think maybe it's something that happened, just like we are born. So if sometime maybe next time, or maybe she could in the end conclude on it as to how would you differentiate between the psychological impact of the man-made calamity, man-made injustice, and something from the nature. I mean, there should be, in the end, some psychological differences, very, very prominent, but there should be some.
I don't mean to take away from you, Majid, but I will respond just briefly to say that in Hawaii, I get your distinction between man-made and nature, but the people died from venereal disease and smallpox because they had no immunities. The islands were essentially sterile, and Hawaiians had no immunities to the diseases. So they died of natural causes too. They weren't all slaughtered by war. Yes, many Native Americans succumbed to that. The history of the historic, which is why they call it historical trauma, that can play out in different ways, but I think the end result is always the same. It's trauma, and it's a suffering that people have, and they need to find a way to heal that trauma or address that trauma. So, while the cause might be different or the history might be different, I believe the outcomes are the same, and it is we who decide whether we are going to be victims to that outcome or be victorious. We may have lost loved ones, but by the same token, so I don't mean to overshare. This is very personal for me, but I just lost my husband of 38 years to a 10-year journey with cancer. I witnessed him, a very, very wonderful person. After he got his diagnosis, his attitude towards life was basically waiting to die. He went through the motions, he got up every day, he did what he needed to do, but he was waiting to die. It's easy to say if that were me because I don't have cancer, but I can tell you that what I would do is I would live to my fullest, because if I'm gonna go tomorrow, I would at least have experienced my life up to the final day. My husband did not. He stayed in, he stayed home, he withdrew from everything and everybody because he was waiting to die. And therein lies the difference. Not the cause, not whether it's natural or man-made, but it's how we choose to respond to it. At least that's my opinion, and that's my experience in what I've seen dealing with population sciences and these large group phenomena.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you.
Beautiful. Noah, you have to say something. You have interesting comments on all these things.
No, thank you, Dr. Joe. And Wendy, I appreciate the courage, the personal courage, the kind of spiritual family truth telling that you're doing in the context of real analysis of many systems of culture and worldview kind of both clashing and starting to wake up more and more to the possibility that they could come together. Kind of like, there's this whole piece of wisdom around the eagle and the condor that I've studied for many years, and you can start to see, like, through this quote unquote tragedy, there could be transformation, just in the bigger kind of context of the spiritual evolution of the world. So, and I appreciate what you're saying too, because I saw my father be in more pain with his Parkinson's that he died from a few years ago than any person would want to see a loved one be in pain. And he was doing the Tibetan Dzogchen practices of Chod and a lot of Nundro practice and very advanced Tibetan, you could call indigenous practices of the Tibetan people for learning how to become peaceful before you die. And I think that there is a whole cultural conversation that is had, in my experience, in many Buddhist and Hindu circles, and also in other indigenous circles about death, that is actually a very powerful way to deal with the cycles of life and the observation of nature that you were talking about. It's so missing in the West. It's missing in the media. And I think that learning how to talk about cycles of life and death and how to celebrate and be respectful of each part of the cycle is actually going to bring a lot of peace to people the more we can have that conversation. Because at the same side of a death toll looking tragic, those are a lot of people moving on. And, it does really seem like when a disease like cancer or Parkinson's or COVID takes someone too soon, it's really painful to be with. But at the same time, we got to prepare to die, and hopefully we learn how to celebrate our life in the process. And so that's a big conversation that's just missing in the public. And it does, when you really have that conversation, it does start to bring peace to this whole process. And you're like, yeah, we're going to birth and we're going to die, and we can't always control when that's going to happen. But there are things that we can do that with more peace or more pain. There is there's ways to do that. So I think it's important that, at least for me, that I use my master's program and my eventual PhD work to kind of help bring that into the culture of society and make those conversations more popular and more prevalent. So that's all the things that your presentation brought up for me. Thank you so much.
Ian, what do you think? We need a philosopher here to weigh in.
Well, what I latched onto, and it's connected at least tangentially to some of the comments that have already been made, was the idea of the native peoples getting tired of being looked at as, and looking at themselves as victims, and deciding to look at their own story to find points of strength, to find points of, what it was that kept them around, kept them going. And I think that part of Wendy's presentation was very suggestive, and particularly for what we're going through now. And so far as what you could take away from indigenous wisdoms that can help you, I think that ranks highly.
Thank you. Levi, do you have any comments you'd like to make? We'd love to hear from you.
My comment has to do with the connectedness that Dr. Peters mentioned. When you grow up in what you call the traditional society, you just don't, as a child, belong to one family. You are a member of multiple families. One of the issues that I was reminded of is the fact that when I was growing up in a traditional society, for example, I am originally from Liberia, West Africa. There would be time when my mother would say to me, when your father comes home, you will eat. And she will take my food and give it to the neighbor children who did not have the same means. And I'm reminded of the interconnectedness of people living in the same community. For her, something I could not understand. Why was it her responsibility to feed, for example, the children in the community who did not have comparable means? And I had to wait for my father to come home to eat. But she could not explain that to me. She just went and said, you will eat when your father comes home. These kids need to eat now, because if they had means, they won't be here in our community. So I was reminded of the interconnectedness that traditional society put on resources in the community. The other thing was, during my studies as a graduate student, it was also brought home that, for example, famine in an individual society or individualized society, yes, one family can starve or be adversely impacted by famine. But in a traditional society, famine was a community thing. If there were famine, it was a famine of the community, because in terms of making farms, agriculture that supported each family, there will be rotational cooperatives. 1, 2, 3 days, the community will congregate and work on your farm. And that rotation will happen to every family in the community. So that if there were famine, hunger season, it will not just be a family affair, it will be a community affair, because they look out for each other in terms of the cooperative that existed. So again, I was reminded of the interconnectedness of the community in a traditional setting.
Thank you. Thank you. Joe, it looks about time for us to take a break. Give everyone a chance to stretch and to get some water or tea or coffee, and come back and look forward to hearing. This has been a wonderful conversation again in our chat. And we also have the Google link that is available that you can continue to share as we are generating this information, this living document. So most definitely continue to comment and to reflect in the chat. But we'll take a break and we'll come back here in about 10 minutes so that we can get ready to hear about self-leadership during the COVID pandemic. And we will have Rashad Nelms next. He'll be the next person that you hear. So let's have a break. Thank you, everyone.
Well, I apologize. There was a break room malfunction. it had 3 rooms, but it assigned 1 person to one room and 2 persons to another room. So anyway, I'll figure
I thought
it out.
that little go around went well though.
It was okay. It was okay. I mean, that it's okay. I would like for everybody to have the chance to share who wants to. That is very important to me. But we've got the rest of the day
to fix the problem, I guess.
Please have a break.
Hey, Joe.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah.
Joe, can you hear me?
Who's this?
It's Jeremy Hayes.
Yes. Hi, Jeremy.
Hi, Joe. Yeah, no, I had tried to chime in a couple of times, and I wasn't certain. So that's good. I just wanted to check my audio.
I actually wanted to call on you. I couldn't see you.
Oh, well, and that's so I've got a limited data connection, so I've got the data turned off. So I got the video turned off.
Oh, I see. Okay. I
hopefully
see. I was going to call Lynn instead, and you were next in queue, but Falame showed up.
Joe, this is Ken. Do you want to stop the recording for a couple of minutes and then
Sure.
restart it for the next session?